On August 27, 1859, in a town called Titusville, in the state of Pennsylvania, a drill rented by Edwin Drake reached 20 meters in depth. It touched something dark and thick that began to ascend through the pipe. Drake, a former railroad worker with no training in geology or engineering, had been the butt of local jokes for months, called Drake's Folly, for digging in a field in search of oil. What came out of the pipe that day produced 25 barrels a day during the first few weeks. In 12 months, the Oil Creek Valley was the most frantically exploited territory in American history. Hundreds of wells, thousands of speculators, and a product that no one really knew how to transport or sell. The world of oil began as chaos. It never entirely stopped being so. Drake's well was not the first in history. Humans had known about oil seeping naturally onto the surface in various parts of the world since the most remote antiquity. The Babylonians used bitumen, the semi-solid form of oil that emerged from natural seeps in Mesopotamia, as mortar in their buildings, including the walls of Babylon and the boats navigating the Euphrates canals. The Chinese drilled the first wells on written record in the 4th century AD, using bamboo drills to extract oil seeping near salt deposits in Sichuan province. The native peoples of North America knew of oil seeps and used them for medicinal purposes, as waterproofing, and as occasional fuel, long before any European arrived on the continent. The oil surfacing in Mesopotamia was so abundant and visible that its inhabitants had no reason to treat it as anything extraordinary. It was simply a substance emerging from the ground that could waterproof papyrus boats and burned with a dirty but functional flame. Babylonian texts mention bitumen, the semi-solid form of oil, with the indifference of someone describing ordinary building material. When Herodotus visited Babylon in the 5th century BC and described the city's walls, he mentioned bitumen as the mortar holding them together, as naturally as he would have mentioned lime. Nobody in Babylon dreamed of burning oil to power machines. The steam engine was still 23 centuries away. What Drake did in Titusville was not discover oil, but prove it could be extracted in industrial quantities by drilling in a controlled manner into the subsoil. Drake's well turned oil from a geological curiosity into an industry. And it did so at the exact moment the market desperately needed it, because the alternative that had sustained artificial lighting in the Western world for the previous century was collapsing. Before oil, the world was lit with whale fat. Sperm whale oil, spermaceti, was the cleanest fuel available for lamps in the 18th century and the first half of the 19th. It burned without smoke, without odor, with a steady white flame that no vegetable oil could imitate. Lighthouse beacons, oil lamps in wealthy homes, hospital lamps, all depended on sperm whale oil. Whaling fleets from New England, the Azores, and Norwegian ports produced it by weathering the planet's worst oceans. Herman Melville did not write Moby Dick as a literary whim. He wrote about the most important industry of his era. The problem with the whaling industry was that sperm whales were running out. 18th century fleets had found the great whale grounds of the North Atlantic and decimated them within decades. 19th century fleets reached the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Arctic. Every new geographic expansion yielded an initial bonanza, followed by a collapse of local populations. By the mid-19th century, expeditions lasted 3 to 4 years, reaching the planet's most remote corners and returning with increasingly empty holds. The price of whale oil rose year after year. The industry didn't collapse because someone regulated it or because no one wanted the product. It collapsed because the animal was running out. Oil arrived just in time. Kerosene, distilled from Pennsylvania crude, was a perfect replacement for whale oil in lighting. Cheaper, more abundant, available without sailing for years through dangerous oceans. The transition from whale oil to petroleum was faster than any economist of the time would have predicted. Shipowners in New Bedford, who had invested fortunes in whaling fleets for decades, found their assets rendered useless within a single generation. Whaling officers, whose knowledge of Arctic navigation represented some of the most demanding expertise of the day, found themselves with no market for their skills. The creative destruction oil brought to the whaling industry foreshadowed the pattern it would repeat throughout its history. Every new application of oil rendered a previous industry obsolete. Coal, horse-drawn streetcars, gas lamps, each found in oil, a competitor they couldn't fight in terms of price or versatility. Within a single decade after Drake's well, the New England whaling industry had lost most of its market. Whalers, who had risked their lives in Antarctic seas, found that the product of their trade was no longer worth what it once was. Pennsylvania oil didn't just create a new industry. It destroyed an old one, and in doing so, accidentally saved sperm whales from the extinction that otherwise awaited them. The oil rush following Drake's well was as chaotic and fast-paced as any gold rush. The Oil Creek Valley went from a quiet, rural landscape to a hive of drilling derricks, storage tanks, makeshift pipelines, and thousands of men arriving by train from every corner of the country, hoping to get rich. In the early months, oil gushed under such high pressure from some wells that it flooded the surrounding ground before enough barrels could be brought to contain it. In other cases, wells exploded, setting fields ablaze and killing drillers. Safety was non-existent, and so was regulation. In the midst of this chaos arrived John Davison Rockefeller. In 1863, Rockefeller was 24 years old and a minor partner in a small trading firm in Cleveland. He never drilled a well. Extraction didn't interest him. What Rockefeller understood better than anyone in the early years of the oil industry was that the real money wasn't in pulling crude out of the ground, but in refining and distributing it. Anyone could drill a well. Very few people could refine crude efficiently and transport it to market. Rockefeller founded his first refinery in Cleveland in 1863 and within 10 years built Standard Oil, the company that would define what a monopoly means. Rockefeller's system of power was built on a mechanism railroaders called rebates, and judges would later call industrial extortion. Rockefeller secretly negotiated special discounts with major railroad companies on the cost of transporting his oil, discounts his competitors couldn't get. Because he shipped more volume than any other refiner, he had the bargaining power to demand those discounts. Because he got those discounts, he could sell cheaper than his competitors. Because he sold cheaper, he captured more market. Because he captured more market, he shipped more volume by train. The circle closed in on itself. By 1870, Standard Oil controlled about 10% of US refining capacity. By 1880, it controlled 90%. The story of how Standard Oil was broken up by the US Supreme Court in 1911 is also the story of how that same monopoly survived its legal destruction. The court ordered Standard Oil dissolved into 34 independent companies. Several of those companies were individually more valuable than the original. Standard Oil of New Jersey would become Exxon. Standard Oil of New York would become Mobil. Standard Oil of California would become Chevron. Rockefeller, who held shares in all of them, became the richest man America had ever produced. Precisely as a result of the dissolution meant to punish him, the state sought to destroy the monopoly and instead multiplied the monopolist's fortune. If Pennsylvania was the birthplace of oil as an industry, Texas was the birthplace of oil as a culture. On January 10, 1901, on a hill called Spindletop near Beaumont in southeastern Texas, drillers working for Petillo Higgins and Captain Anthony Lucas felt the ground tremble beneath their feet. First came mud, then gas, and then oil erupted under such enormous pressure that it launched a column of crude 30 meters high for 9 days before anyone could control it. The Spindletop well produced more oil in a single day than all the wells in Pennsylvania combined. That single field quadrupled total US oil production overnight. The Texas Wildcatter was the specific form private enterprise took in the American oil industry, and that form shaped oil culture in ways that set it apart from European or Gulf industries. In Great Britain, oil was from the start a state or semi-corporate venture. In Gulf countries, it was a concession managed by foreign companies under state supervision. In Texas, it was an individual gamble that could make you rich overnight or ruin you just as fast. This culture of individual gambling explains part of the American industry's historical resistance to any regulation. Those who survived did so by betting against the consensus. That experience breeds lasting hostility toward any institution claiming to know more than the man who drilled the well. Spindletop was not only important in terms of volume, it shifted the geography of power within the industry. Standard Oil did not control Spindletop or Texas. The companies that did arrive, the Texas Company, which would become Texaco, Gulf Oil, Sun Oil, created a new generation of giants that broke the monopoly before the Supreme Court attempted to do so legally. Texas also transformed the cultural perception of oil in the United States. In Pennsylvania, oil was one industry among many. In Texas, oil became an identity, the figure of the Texas wildcatter, the independent prospector betting everything on a single well-entered American mythology as a heroic symbol of free enterprise and individual fortune. Texas oil was loud, flashy, excessive, and completely detached from any notion of sustainability or long-term planning. While Rockefeller built his empire in Ohio and Texas, wildcatters drilled along the Gulf, the British Empire looked east with a different sense of urgency. In 1901, William Knox D'Arcy negotiated with the Shah of Persia the first major oil concession in the Middle East. 60 years of exclusive exploration rights across most Persian territory in exchange for £20,000 in cash, £20,000 in shares, and a 16% royalty. D'Arcy spent the next 7 years spending his personal fortune looking for oil without finding any. Just as he was about to give up in May 1908, his drillers struck a field at Masjed Solomon that turned out to be one of the richest in the world. D'Arcy's concession became what would be the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later British Petroleum, later BP. The British government understood the strategic importance of Persian oil before any other European government, and the person responsible for that insight was Winston Churchill. Churchill had to overcome considerable resistance within the Navy and Parliament to convert the Royal Navy to oil. The counter-arguments were solid. Great Britain had coal in abundance in Wales, while oil depended on vulnerable foreign sources. Admirals distrusted a new technology, whose combat failures they couldn't yet predict. Churchill refuted every argument. Oil-powered ships were 30% faster than equivalent coal-powered ships, needed half the boiler crew, could refuel at sea, something coal ships couldn't practically do, and produced less smoke, making them harder to spot on the horizon. In the coming war, Churchill was right on every point. By 1911, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, tasked with keeping the British naval fleet combat-ready. The Royal Navy was the most powerful in the world, but depended on Welsh coal to move. Churchill decided to convert it to oil. Oil ships were faster, more efficient, and required smaller crews than coal ships. The problem was that Britain had no oil of its own. Churchill's government bought a controlling stake in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company in 1914 to secure the fleet's supply. That decision turned control of Persian oil into a matter of British national security that would remain so for decades. The First World War confirmed that oil was already a top-tier strategic variable. General Edmund Allenby, who led the British campaign in Palestine and Mesopotamia between 1916 and 1918, used trucks and motorized vehicles to move troops at speeds previous armies couldn't fathom. The armistice ending the war in November 1918 redistributed not only the territories of defeated empires, but access to oil. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 drew the borders of the modern Middle East without consulting any local populations. It was also an agreement over control of Mesopotamian oil fields that geologists already knew existed under what would become Iraq. The nationalization of the Iranian oil industry by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in April 1951 was the first direct clash between a producing government and the Seven Sisters. Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and expelled its technicians from the country. Great Britain responded with a naval blockade and asked the United States to intervene. In August 1953, the CIA and MI6 organized the coup d'état that ousted Mossadegh and restored absolute power to the Shah, who signed new conditions far more favorable to foreign companies. The arrangement lasted 26 years, until the Islamic Revolution of 1979. The humiliation of the coup, widely known in Iran yet ignored in the West, was one of the factors fueling hostility toward the United States that Ayatollah Khomeini's revolution channeled decades later. On September 28, 1928, at a Scottish castle called Achnacarry, representatives from 7 of the world's largest oil companies gathered under the pretense of a hunting party. What they signed was not a hunting agreement. It was the most important document in the history of the oil market until the creation of OPEC, the Achnacarry Agreement, also known as the As-Is Agreement. The parties secretly agreed to freeze their market shares at current levels, refrain from competing against one another in new markets, and share production and distribution facilities to cut costs. In other words, they agreed that oil prices would be set by them, not the market. The cartel economists would later call the Seven Sisters was born in that Scottish castle. The oil pricing system used by the Seven Sisters before 1973 was a masterpiece of accounting opacity. The posted price, the so-called list price per barrel, in the Persian Gulf, was not the price at which oil was actually sold among network companies. Companies transacted with each other at prices that could vary significantly from the list price, and these differences determined how much tax they paid to producing countries. Since royalties were calculated based on declared transaction prices, a producing country seeking to verify whether companies were declaring the correct price needed access to the accounting books of multinational corporations across multiple jurisdictions, represented by lawyers who had spent decades refining their legal structures. Venezuela was the first country to understand and articulate the problem with enough technical precision to do something about it. Venezuelan economist Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso was the primary driving force behind the creation of OPEC in 1960. His motivation was to regain control over prices. The Seven Sisters had turned into a black box. The Seven Sisters controlled the global oil market for 40 years, with an efficiency no international regulator could have matched. They set the price at which producing countries sold their crude, the terms of concessions, and the flow of oil through a network of pipelines, tankers, and refineries that virtually no producing government directly controlled. Royalties paid to the governments of Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait were set unilaterally by the companies themselves under accounting formulas receiving governments. Took decades to understand well enough to challenge. Persian Gulf oil enriched Anglo-American companies for a generation before significantly enriching the countries under whose soil it lay. The story of Arab oil prior to the creation of OPEC is also the story of political transformation in the countries producing it. In 1945, Saudi Arabia was a nation without modern infrastructure, without systematic public education, without a banking system, and without the administrative capacity to manage the revenues oil was beginning to generate. Ibn Saud signed the agreement with Roosevelt without a single Saudi official possessing the technical background to negotiate oil terms on equal footing with the geologists and lawyers of Standard Oil of California. The king had unified the peninsula by the sword. The oil economy was an entirely different world. The initial concession agreements signed by Aramco, the Arabian-American oil company, with the Saudi government were, by any honest retrospective assessment, extraordinarily favorable to American companies. The shift in balance brought about by the 1973 crisis was partly the result of 30 years spent building a Saudi technical class capable of reading contracts and understanding what they were signing. Before continuing, if this is the kind of story you're looking for, of power systems operating beneath the surface of daily news, subscribe. The Yom Kippur War triggered the embargo, but the context had been building for years. Arab-producing countries had spent a decade trying to use oil as political leverage with limited success. What made 1973 different was the convergence of 3 simultaneous factors. the exhaustion of US spare capacity, making the market structurally dependent on Arab crude, greater coordination within OPEC, thanks to Ahmed Zaki Yamani's work, and Saudi Arabia's willingness to absorb the economic cost of a sustained embargo. When Arab nations announced the cut, the global market had no alternative. The market power the Seven Sisters had exercised for 40 years had shifted to their biggest suppliers. World War II was, to an extent, rarely emphasized in history textbooks, a war for oil. Japan had no domestic oil. In 1941, it imported 80% of its oil from the United States. When the Roosevelt administration imposed an embargo on oil exports to Japan in August of that year, Japan had enough reserves for 18 months of military operations. The strategic choice made by the Japanese High Command was straightforward. If they couldn't buy oil from the United States, they would take it from the Dutch East Indies, where Shell and other companies controlled massive fields. But to do that, they needed to neutralize the US Pacific Fleet's ability to intercept them. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was not a sudden burst of imperial aggression. It was a cold logistical calculation over oil. On the European front, Hitler's obsession with oil dictated Eastern Front strategy in ways that proved fatal for Germany. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, had three targets: Leningrad in the north, Moscow in the center, and the Caucasus in the south. The southern objective was the only one that truly mattered in terms of resources. The Baku oil fields in modern-day Azerbaijan produced nearly 90% of Soviet oil. If Germany captured them, the Red Army would run out of fuel. Splitting forces between Stalingrad and the Caucasus in the summer of 1942 was the strategic blunder historians pinpoint as the turning point of the war in the East. They never reached Baku. Oil also dictated the terms of peace. The division of the Middle East emerging from World War II consolidated Western control over Gulf fields with a clarity the previous colonial era had never fully achieved. The United States, emerging as the dominant Western power, established security relationships with producing nations that combined political and military backing with preferential access to their oil. Roosevelt's meeting with Ibn Saud aboard the cruiser USS Quincy in February 1945 laid the groundwork for the strategic pact that has structured Middle Eastern politics ever since. Roosevelt offered security. Ibn Saud offered oil. The deal lasted 80 years. Journalist Ida Tarbell published her history of the Standard Oil Company in McClure's magazine between 1902 and 1904 across 19 articles, widely considered the launching pad of modern investigative journalism in the United States. Tarbell's father had been a small Pennsylvania oil producer ruined by Standard Oil's practices, and her investigation combined historical rigor with the moral urgency of someone who had witnessed the monopoly up close. The articles documented the railroad rebate system, predatory pricing, and industrial espionage tactics Rockefeller used to eliminate rivals. The series reached 4 million readers per installment. It was the combination of Tarbell's work and investigations by the Ohio Attorney General that brought the case before the Supreme Court. Dependence on oil also altered urban architecture in ways so pervasive today they have become invisible. The 20th century American city was designed around the assumption that every family owned one or more cars and that the fuel to run them would always be cheap. Multi-lane highways, parking lots occupying more surface area in many American cities than buildings themselves, the absence of sidewalks in zones built strictly for motorized traffic. All of this is oil transformed into urban planning. The European city, built largely before the automobile, possesses a density and pedestrian connectivity the American city lacks, making its residents far less reliant on oil for daily travel. This structural difference between European and American cities explains part of the gap in per capita oil consumption between the two regions and part of America's greater vulnerability to oil price shocks. Petroleum didn't just fuel cars, it shaped the spaces we inhabit. The 1973 oil crisis was the first time producing countries demonstrated they could wield oil as a weapon. On October 16th, Arab OPEC members announced they would cut production by 5% monthly until Israel withdrew from occupied territories. The Yom Kippur War had begun 9 days earlier. The measure directly targeted the United States and the Netherlands for supporting Israel. Within 3 months, the price per barrel jumped from $3 to $12. In some markets, physical oil was unavailable at any price. Gas station lines in the United States stretched for miles. President Nixon imposed a 55-mile-per-hour speed limit on federal highways to curb consumption. What the 1973 crisis proved to the world was not just that oil was strategically indispensable that was already known. It proved producing countries could organize to impose their will on consuming nations, including the United States. The Seven Sisters, who had dictated prices for 40 years, were gradually displaced by producing governments themselves, which had been nationalizing their oil industries throughout the 1960s and 70s. OPEC, founded in 1960 in Baghdad by Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and Venezuela, evolved from a consultative forum into a potent instrument of economic policy. Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, the Saudi oil minister, became the public face of that power, elegant, articulate, fully capable of explaining on television why the Western world had to pay whatever price OPEC set. The 1973 crisis also accelerated a transformation in the international monetary system. Nixon had ended the dollar's convertibility into gold in August 1971, killing the Bretton Woods system that had governed the global economy since World War II, with the dollar pegged to gold. What Henry Kissinger constructed through secret negotiations with the Saudi government was the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia and Gulf-producing nations agreed to price their oil sales exclusively in US dollars and recycle their surpluses into US Treasury bonds. In return, the United States guaranteed the military security of the Saudi regime. Oil came to back the dollar, much as gold had done before. Any country wanting to buy oil, meaning every country on Earth, needed dollars. The demand for dollars became permanent and structural. The exorbitant privilege this system conferred on the United States funding deficits indefinitely because the world would always need its currency was so extraordinary that economists still debate whether it was the single greatest strategic benefit of the post-war era. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990 is the clearest example of the relationship between oil and security policy in the 20th century. Saddam Hussein had 2 reasons to invade Kuwait. The first was debt. Iraq had borrowed tens of billions of dollars from Kuwait during the war against Iran in the 1980s, and Saddam wanted forgiveness. The second was the Rumaila oil field, one of the region's largest, spanning the border between Iraq and Kuwait. Kuwait was slant drilling into the Iraqi portion of the field, extracting oil Saddam claimed as his own. The US response was Operation Desert Storm, the first real-time televised war. The official justification was restoring Kuwaiti sovereignty. The structural motive was ensuring the world's largest oil reserves didn't fall under hostile control. The Second Gulf War in 2003 was about oil in a way the Bush administration never articulated so plainly, but which critics documented with abundant circumstantial evidence. Iraq held the world's 4th largest proven oil reserves. The oil contracts Saddam Hussein's government had signed with Russian, French, and Chinese companies included no Anglo-American firms. The list of targets secured by American forces in the opening hours of the invasion included the oil ministry and southern oil fields. The comparison made by critics was uncomfortable. Why did the United States intervene to liberate Kuwait, but not in Rwanda, Bosnia, or dozens of other humanitarian crises of that era? The simplest answer was also the most obvious. Fracking transformed oil geopolitics, but caused environmental consequences that proponents minimized and critics exaggerated. Hydraulic fracturing requires vast amounts of water, between 15 and 30 million liters per well, mixed with sand and chemicals, injected at high pressure into rock. The water returning to the surface carries original chemicals, plus minerals and radioactive elements released from the rock. In parts of Texas and Oklahoma, wastewater injection into disposal wells caused small earthquakes that regulators were slow to acknowledge as human-induced. Methane emissions from fracking wells turned out to be significantly higher than early models predicted, undercutting part of the climate advantage shale gas held over coal. The revolution was real in terms of production. Its environmental consequences were more complex than either side cared to admit. The fracking revolution transformed the oil market in the decade of 2010, impacting the global balance of power on a scale comparable to the 1973 crisis, but in reverse. Hydraulic fracturing technology, injecting water, sand, and chemicals at high pressure into shale rock to release trapped crude, had existed in rudimentary forms since the 1940s. Combining this technique with horizontal drilling allowed American producers to tap oil in the Bakken Shale in North Dakota and the Eagle Ford in Texas in ways previously unviable. Between 2008 and 2018, U.S. production surged from 5 million barrels a day to over 12 million. Once again, it was the world's top producer, surpassing Saudi Arabia and Russia. Geopolitical consequences were immediate and far-reaching. OPEC's bargaining power shrank significantly because the United States no longer relied on imports to the same degree. Producing nations whose economies depended on high crude prices, Venezuela, Russia, Iran, felt the squeeze of a market that took years to absorb the flood of new supply. Crude prices, which had stayed above $100 for years, plummeted below $30 in the winter of 2015 and 2016 before partially recovering. America's ability to maintain sanctions on Russia or Iran without endangering its own energy supply became a foreign policy tool that import reliance had made impossible for decades. The 21st century energy transition has historical precedents worth examining carefully before making predictions about its speed or completion. The shift from wood to coal in Western Europe took nearly a century, driven by deforestation in densely populated areas that made wood scarce and expensive, just as industrial demand spiked. The shift from coal to oil was driven by the technical superiority of the internal combustion engine over the steam engine for mobile uses. A steam-powered car was practical nonsense. A steam-powered airplane was flatly impossible. In both cases, the transition was irreversible, yet incomplete. Wood remains a primary heating source in vast regions of the world, and coal still generates a significant portion of global electricity. The transition from oil to renewables will unfold differently. The pressure stems not from physical scarcity proven, reserves guarantee at least 50 more years, but from the climate impacts of burning it. It is the first energy transition driven not by economics, but by ecology. Oil has transformed human civilization over 150 years in ways no other energy source ever matched. Starting from zero, it came to structure the entire global economy. Industrial agriculture feeding 8 billion people relies on petroleum-derived fertilizers, as does the transportation connecting global markets. The synthesis of plastics forming most everyday objects depends on oil. The electricity powering digital networks that reorganized human communication still relies partly on oil, albeit in declining proportions. The transition demanded by climate change is the first in energy history where humanity attempts to abandon a source before it runs out, or is replaced by a technically superior alternative. International treaties from Kyoto to Paris have codified this in more or less binding terms. Every prior energy transition, wood to coal, coal to oil, occurred because the new source was cheaper or more efficient, not because anyone decided the existing source was harmful and had to be replaced for reasons outside market logic. The transition we are living through is distinct in its nature and in the conflicts it generates. Precisely because of this, what Edwin Drake pulled from Pennsylvania soil in August 1859 was a liquid that over 150 years funded empires, sparked wars, saved whales, and destroyed ecosystems. We have yet to fully comprehend its ultimate consequences on power relations between nations. The first barrel of oil Drake filled that day carried none of those consequences inside it. It was simply a dark, thick liquid that smelled bad and that someone decided might be worth money. The most momentous things in history usually begin that way. Over the last 50 years, the price of a barrel of oil has served as the most sensitive barometer of global political economy. When prices spike abruptly in 1973, in 2008, in 2014, the impact on importing economies is equivalent to a massive tax levied without parliamentary approval. Every cent increase in the price per barrel transfers wealth from consumers to producers. Because oil is inelastic in the short term, people must heat homes and drive regardless of price. The distributive impact is regressive, hitting the poor hardest as they spend a larger fraction of their income on energy. Oil crises are not merely economic shocks. They are global wealth redistribution mechanisms. The relationship between oil prices and political cycles in producing nations is equally mechanical. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez sustained social programs and an aggressive foreign policy as long as crude stayed above $80. When prices crashed below $40 between 2014 and 2016, the Venezuelan economic system entered a downward spiral from which it has yet to emerge. Russia funded its rearmament and Eastern European influence while prices were high. When prices dropped, the Russian budget contracted. Iran, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Algeria all have fiscal break-even points, requiring crude prices above specific thresholds. When the market betrays them, the ensuing political instability is predictable with a regularity that discredits any analysis ignoring crude economics. The story of oil is also, ultimately, the story of the greatest concentration of wealth per unit of land in human history. The Persian Gulf fields, Saudi Ghawar, Iraqi Rumaila, Kuwaiti Burgan contain more economic value per square kilometer than any mining or agricultural region on the planet. This concentration generated both the Gulf monarchies with their trillion-dollar sovereign wealth funds and the wars fought to control or redistribute that wealth. Edwin Drake died in poverty in 1880. He never patented his drilling technique, and the speculators who followed proved far shrewder in business. He could never have envisioned the chain of events set in motion that August 1859. The story of oil began with a man his neighbors called Drake's Folly. It will end with the consequences of atmospheric warming. No single individual saw coming. The role of oil in the second half of the 20th century cannot be understood without also understanding what the automobile did to the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people. In 1950, there were approximately 50 million cars worldwide. By 1980, there were 500 million. By 2025, there are over 1 billion. Every single one of those vehicles is an oil consumer. The automobile's transformation from a luxury item into a mass consumer good largely explains why global demand has grown continuously for 70 years despite price shocks. The automobile also transformed warfare. Armies moving on foot or horseback depended on terrain and forage supply lines. Motorized armies moved faster, farther, and with greater firepower, but depended on fuel supply lines that became their Achilles heel if cut by the enemy. Rommel drove the Afrika Korps across the North African desert to the edges of Egypt in 1942. He was defeated not by the British Army's tactical superiority, but by running out of fuel. His tanks were better, his men just as good. But the tanker trucks bringing oil from North Africa didn't arrive regularly enough, and the Mediterranean they had to cross was dominated by the Royal Navy. Rommel lost the Battle of El Alamein, partly at the fuel dumps that never arrived. The story of how oil built the modern world is also the story of what that world has cost in emissions, conflicts, and dependencies that no country foresaw clearly as they were being established. The carbon in the atmosphere today is largely the carbon from oil burned between 1859 and 2025. It was not malice. It was ignorance first, inertia second, and over the last 50 years, when evidence of climate change was clear enough, a calculation of short-term interests that nations, corporations, and individuals kept making while they could. The story of oil is the most important story of the 20th century. The story of what we do with its climate consequences will be the most important story of the 21st century.